Hey everyone, today I'm looking at another type of landing that you can try in Microsoft Flight Simulator if you're looking for a little bit of a challenge or you're just looking to switch things up, and that's the power off landing. Power off landings help you learn to judge distances a lot better, which is why I think they're kind of cool to practice in the game. You'll also develop a better sense of how far the airplane can glide and have a better understanding of the forces at play when you're trying to land. I'm going to look at a few different variations of this landing, notably the 90-degree power-off landing and the 180-degree power-off landing. I find a 180-degree power-off landing to be a little bit easier to time and execute, but as you're going to see in either case, the wind can drastically change how you fly the approach. I'll be using the Cessna 152 for this flight, but you can of course do this in any airplane in the game, and it's going to be different depending on what airplane you use as well. Each airplane handles differently with the power off, can glide a different distance, and obviously glides at a different airspeed as well. So it can be pretty fun to just try it out with all the different planes and see how they react differently. Alright, let's start by looking at the 90-degree power off landing. The best way to practice the power off landing is to actually only select the airport that you want to land at from the arrival airport section right here. Don't choose anything for the departure airport. So in my case, I'm just going to choose Paradise Beach Airport right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select the opposite runway from which I want to land. In my case, I want to land on runway 8, so I'm going to leave it at runway 26. What that's going to do is it's going to set me up on final for runway 26. At which point I'll be able to just, instead of come in for the landing, move into the downwind position and then fly the rest of my approach down to runway 08. I'll show you what I mean. Once the game's loaded and I'm ready to press ready to fly, I'm always ready to go straight up to the game menu and hit the pause button because the plane's going to tend to get a little bit out of sorts. At this point, the plane is all set up for final approach. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to retract the flaps to set myself up for my approach rather than for landing. And then I'm going to increase the elevator trim so that it's in a little bit of a better position for straight and level flight. At this point, I've got two choices. I can either unpause the game and fly myself into position on the downwind leg, which is going to be around right here. Or the other option is that I can go into slew mode by pressing the Y key, and then using my Xbox controller, I'm just going to put the airplane into the position that I want on the downwind leg right around here. And then I'm going to come out of slew mode, unpause the game, and fly the airplane from this position. I found it's best to be a full mile away from the runway when you're trying to practice this approach. It's going to give you a little bit of extra time on the base leg, and you're going to see in a second why I'm going to need it. Now, the first major difference with this approach is that once I come a beam of the runway threshold, I'm not going to start descending quite yet. I'm going to turn onto base like I normally would when the airport is around 45 degrees off the backside of the airplane, but without doing the descent at the same time. Alright, so we are coming a beam of the runway right there, and now I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to hold my altitude. I'm just going to keep checking my position to see where I'm at, and once the runway is 45 degrees off the back of the airplane, I'm going to make my turn towards base. If the winds were stronger, I would probably end up doing the base turn a little bit sooner, just like you would normally. And if the winds were really strong, I'd probably do it even sooner, just because I'll be traveling a shorter distance over the ground since my ground speed is going to be a lot lower. For all of the power off approaches, you're going to fly them at the recommended glide speed of the airplane. This airspeed is going to be different depending on what airplane you're flying. In this case, I'm flying the Cessna 152, which has a glide speed of 60 knots. That means that flying the airplane at 60 knots is going to allow me to fly the furthest distance over the ground. So as I am getting ready to make my turn here, when I do start my turn in a couple of seconds, I'm actually going to do the turn at around 30 degrees of bank so that I can roll out on base as quickly as possible. The reason for that is that we want that little bit of extra time on base, since that's where we're going to be cutting the power and starting our descent, which is obviously a lot later than we normally would have started the descent. Alright, so here we go. So now once I do roll out, I'm going to check to see where the runway is relative to the airplane. And just like usual, once it's 45 degrees off the forward side of the airplane, I'm gonna cut the power completely so that the airspeed starts to drop. And I'm also gonna start my turn on to final. This is where I have to start making a judgment call. With the power fixed at idle, I only have the pitch to control the airspeed of the airplane. So if I see I'm going too fast like I am right now, I'm going to shallow up my approach so that I can drop the airspeed down to 60, and after that I'll keep adjusting the pitch to keep myself at 60 knots. Now I also need to judge the descent rate that I've got and make sure that I'm going to make the runway. My target point is still going to be the first third of the runway, effectively where you can see it runs off to the side there with the taxiway. So what I've got to do is judge how much of a descent rate I need to be able to land on that little section of runway. In this case, I can see I'm a little bit high and my airspeed is alright, but what I'm going to do is add a little bit of flaps to make sure that I make it down exactly where I want. And from there, I'm just going to wait and see how it adjusts. And if I see that I'm okay, I'm going to not add more flaps, because once you've added more flaps, it's basically impossible to remove the flaps because you'll end up losing a lot of lift if you do so. Once I get close to the runway, that's where I'm going to start shallowing up my approach. As you can see, my airspeed is dropping a little bit closer to normal touchdown speed. And then I'll just let the airplane settle down with a very soft landing right there. So again, the key points are really maintaining your airspeed at the glide speed of the airplane, which in this case is 60 knots, as well as making sure that you don't end up too short of the runway or overshoot the runway either. If you do end up coming up a little bit short on your first attempts, you've got a few choices. You can either let the plane crash and just restart over, or you can add a little bit of power or just go into slew mode and try the whole thing over again. That's the beauty of the game. You can really retry it any number of times that you want. One thing that I did forget to mention is that if you really want to do like in the real world, you would probably turn the carb heat on when you drop the power to idle. But in the game, it honestly really doesn't make that much of a difference. The airplane's wear and tear is not going to carry over from one flight to the next, so I really don't bother with it. The power off run 80 requires a bit more judgment to execute properly because you need to decide when to turn onto base. But like I said earlier, I find it easier to execute than the 90-degree power off, since it's a lot more like a normal landing would be, except you've got the throttle at idle. Just like last time, I've set myself up by choosing the arrival airport in the world map, and I chose the opposite runway I want to land at, and then I flew myself into position onto downwind. I'm not quite as wide as I was last time. I'm a little bit closer because I don't need quite as much time on base. Unlike last time though, once I'm abeam the runway, I'm going to start reducing power to idle, and I'm going to let the airspeed bleed off to 60 knots before I start my descent. Once I do make it to 60 knots, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pitch the airplane to maintain 60 knots the whole way down to the runway. Now, the main reason I'm using the Cessna 152 to demonstrate this is that it's got this big clock right in the middle of the instrument panel. I found once I actually reduce the power to flight idle, if I count somewhere between 20 to 25 seconds, that's about when I should be turning on to base to make my landing as smoothly as possible with a glide path of around 4 degrees or so. This number is obviously going to be different based on the plane you're flying, and it's also going to vary depending on how much wind there is. If there's more wind, you'll probably want to turn base more like at 18 to 20 seconds, and if there's less wind or no wind at all, you'll probably want to be closer to 25 seconds. Again, I made my turn at 30 degrees of bank, and I made sure to keep an eye on my airspeed the whole time I'm making the turn. And again, I'm really just using the pitch to maintain airspeed. If I see I'm getting a little bit shallow on airspeed, I'll drop the nose a little bit more, and if I see my airspeed is getting too fast, I'll pull it up a wee bit as well. At this point, I'm really just keeping an eye on my descent rate, which just seems about right. I'm a little bit high, but I am descending at around 4-ish, 4.5 degrees or so. And what I'm looking to do is just to let the airplane come to a stable landing on that first third of the runway again. At this point, I'm going to add 1 notch of flaps just to help the airplane stabilize. Because my descent rate is pretty good, I didn't add too much flaps because they weren't really necessary in this case. And like I said earlier, sometimes too much flaps isn't a good idea because you could end up coming up short on the runway as well. And there we go, I am on the ground. I really suggest that you try these approaches with the Cessna 152 first, and then try it with different airplanes so you can compare and contrast. You're going to see a lot of different airplanes are going to glide very differently. Some are going to feel like they're just falling out of the sky, and others, like the 152, just feels like it could float forever. In fact, the number one problem that I had when I was practicing this technique to make this video today is that I found I was actually floating too much, and I was always coming in a little bit too high or higher than I thought I would be for a given position. In the real world, you would never want to do a dive down to the runway, but in the game, it's not the end of the world either. Once I realized I was coming in too high, what I ended up doing was going the opposite and coming up a little bit too short. And I did crash once or twice into the ground and into the trees right in front of this runway. At any rate, I do hope you learned something useful in this video. I highly recommend trying the power off landings. I find they're a lot of fun to do. I wish there was more of a challenge related to this in the game, but sometimes you have to come up with your own challenges to make things interesting as well. On that note, if you do have any comments or questions, please make sure to put it below. And if you got any value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe.